On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat at his headquarters in East Prussia and passed judgment on the United States in a way that would ultimately determine Germany's destiny. He told those closest to him that he saw little long-term promise in the Americans. It was a decaying nation, he claimed. They suffered from racial tensions and deep social inequality. Everything about the conduct of American society, in his view, showed it to be partly Judaized and partly negrified. How, he asked, could such a state possibly remain unified? 7,000 miles away, in a modest shipyard office in Richmond, California, a 57-year-old industrialist named Henry Kaiser was drawing an idea on a scrap of hotel notepaper. He had never built a ship before. His experience lay in dams, highways, and bridges. Ships, after all, were different. Ships were complex. Established shipbuilders insisted it took 8 months to construct a cargo vessel. Kaiser studied his sketch and told his team they would build one in 4 days. Hitler believed Americans were soft. Kaiser was about to prove him disastrously mistaken. The error in judgment had begun well before the first shot of the war. In the years preceding the conflict, German military intelligence assembled reports on American industrial strength, military preparedness, and national character. Their conclusions were strikingly uniform. America was a nation of merchants and consumers, not fighters. Its army in 1939 ranked among the smallest in the world, smaller even than Portugal's. Its factories produced cars and refrigerators, not tanks and airplanes. Its people had grown comfortable during the long peace and lacked the will to sacrifice. Hitler's advisors assured him that American claims about wartime production were mere propaganda. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would manufacture 50,000 aircraft per year, the German High Command dismissed the statement as pure fantasy. In 1939, American military aircraft output totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. The idea that production could rise by nearly 20 times seemed ridiculous. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest associates, shared this disdain. Göring had built the German Air Force from nothing into the most feared air arm in Europe. He understood what was required to produce modern combat aircraft: precision engineering, specialized alloys, skilled labor, and years of accumulated experience refining production techniques. America, he believed, possessed none of these strengths. The notion that an air force could be conjured from automobile plants struck him as laughable. German generals had encountered Americans before. In the final year of the First World War, U.S. troops arrived in France and performed competently, but they entered late, suffered comparatively light casualties, and contributed little to the war's strategic direction. The memory of those green doughboys reinforced the belief that Americans lacked the toughness needed for prolonged combat. Albert Speer, who would later become Hitler's Minister of Armaments, attended many of the Führer's dinner conversations about America. Hitler insisted that Americans had not played a significant role in the war of 1914 to 1918. They had not paid heavily in blood. They would not endure a trial by fire, because their fighting qualities were weak. In general, he argued, there was no such thing as an American people as a unified whole. They were merely a collection of immigrants from many nations and races. This racial reasoning lay at the heart of Hitler's worldview. He believed national strength flowed from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent superiority that would reveal itself on the battlefield. America, a mixed nation of immigrants, Jews, and African Americans, could never match the martial spirit of the German Volk. But the German analysis contained a fatal error. They judged American potential by American peacetime performance. They saw a nation that had not mobilized and assumed it could not. They saw factories producing consumer goods and concluded they could not manufacture weapons. They saw diversity and interpreted it as weakness. They were wrong on every count. The transformation began before America officially entered the war. In the summer of 1940, after France had fallen and Britain stood under siege, Roosevelt challenged American industry to achieve what he called a miracle of production. Automobile plants would stop making cars. Appliance factories would stop producing refrigerators. Every lathe, press, and assembly line in the country would be converted to wartime output. This was not simply a rallying cry. It was a fundamental reorganization of the American economy. In 1941, more than 3 million automobiles rolled off U.S. assembly lines. Over the next 4 years, only 139 more would be built. The entire capacity of the automotive industry was redirected toward weapons. Chrysler produced fuselages. General Motors manufactured aircraft engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for the British Royal Air Force. Companies that had never made anything more dangerous than household appliances learned to manufacture ammunition. The conversion occurred with astonishing speed because American industry possessed capabilities the Germans failed to grasp. The key lay in standardization and interchangeable parts. American factories had pioneered mass production methods that allowed different plants to produce components that fit together perfectly. A carburetor made in Ohio would fit an engine built in Michigan and power a vehicle assembled in California. This system, refined over decades for civilian goods, was now applied to the tools of war. Skeptics insisted it could not be done. Aircraft were not automobiles. You could not stamp out a bomber the way you stamped out a Ford. The tolerances were too exacting. The systems too complex. A single heavy bomber contained more than 1 million parts, while an automobile had only about 15,000. Henry Kaiser ignored the doubters. In December 1940, he won a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for Britain. He had no shipyard, no experience in ship construction, and no workforce trained in maritime trades. What he did have was a system, and the system was everything. Kaiser did not view shipbuilding the way traditional builders did. He treated it as a manufacturing challenge. The specific product, whether a ship, a dam, or a highway, mattered less than the process itself. Any manufacturing task could be analyzed, broken down, optimized, and expanded. Traditional shipbuilders relied on apprenticeship, with skilled riveters spending years mastering their craft. Kaiser did not have years, he had months. So he designed processes that could be learned in days. He replaced labor with capital wherever possible, investing in machines to perform tasks once done by hand. Established shipbuilders scoffed, insisting it would never work. Ships were too complex. The sea was too unforgiving. Vessels built by amateurs would surely fail. Kaiser proved them wrong. His ships were not only completed faster than traditional vessels, they were built better. Defect rates in Kaiser's yards were less than half those in conventional shipyards. The same systematic methods that sped production also improved quality. Kaiser applied the principles that had completed the Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He divided ship construction into modules. Instead of building a vessel from the keel up on a single slipway, he prefabricated large sections in separate locations and assembled them like blocks. He relied on welding rather than riveting, which was quicker and required fewer skilled workers. He recruited laborers from across the nation, built housing for them, created childcare centers for their families, and established a healthcare system to keep them healthy and productive. The transformation of ordinary Americans into shipbuilders occurred at a pace that defied conventional thinking. Men and women who had never seen the ocean, never held a welding torch, and never set foot in an industrial plant learned to build ships in weeks. Kaiser's training programs were relentlessly efficient. In 10 days, a new hire could become a capable welder. In 30 days, they could function as a productive member of a shipbuilding crew. Workers came from everywhere: farmers from Oklahoma driven off their land by drought, factory laborers from Detroit laid off during the Depression, women who had never worked outside the home, and African Americans seeking opportunities long denied to them in the segregated South. The workforce at Kaiser's Richmond yards eventually peaked at over 90,000 people, and nearly a third of them were women. The women who worked in these factories became symbols of American wartime mobilization. They drilled rivets, welded seams, and installed wiring, doing work that had been exclusively male before the war. The government promoted their contributions through posters and films featuring strong, determined women in factory settings. These images became iconic representations of the home-run effort. There were thousands of women like this across America, working in shipyards and aircraft plants, proving that the workforce could expand in ways German planners never anticipated. The established shipbuilders watched in disbelief. They had been building ships the same way for decades. They knew what was possible. Kaiser's methods violated every principle of their craft. Ships were supposed to be riveted, not welded. Construction was supposed to happen on the slipway, not in scattered fabrication shops. Workers were supposed to be trained over years, not weeks. But Kaiser's methods worked. In 1941, the average time to build a Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel of the war, was 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced that to 45 days, then 30 days, then 20 days. In November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard built the Liberty ship, Robert E. Perry, in 4 days and 15 hours. From laying the keel to launching the completed vessel, took less time than a German U-boat needed to cross the Atlantic. The Germans now faced a strategic crisis they had not anticipated. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had staked his strategy on a simple calculation. His submarines would sink Allied shipping faster than the Allies could replace it. In the early months of 1942, this strategy appeared to be working. German U-boat prowled the American East Coast during what they called the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of merchant ships within sight of shore. Oil tankers burned off the coast of Florida. Cargo vessels went down within view of New Jersey beaches. Reinhard Hartigan, commander of U-123, was among the first captains to hunt American waters. In January 1942, he torpedoed ships so close to shore that he could see the glow of city lights reflected off the smoke. The Americans had not implemented blackout procedures. They had not organized convoys. They seemed almost to be inviting attack. Hartigan sank 8 ships on his first patrol and returned to Germany a hero. Other U-boat commanders followed. Through the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. The losses were catastrophic. Oil that should have fueled Allied tanks pulled on Atlantic beaches. Food that should have fed British civilians rotted at the bottom of the sea. Strategic materials essential to the war effort vanished. Beneath the waves, Dönitz believed he was winning. His submarines were inflicting damage at a rate that exceeded his most optimistic projections. If these losses continued, Britain would be strangled. The American war effort would collapse before it could fully mobilize. But even as the U-boat chalked up kills, the shipyards were accelerating. In 1942, American shipyards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, they launched 19 million tons. By the fall of 1943, new construction exceeded losses for the first time. Every ship the U-boat sank was replaced by 2 more. Dönitz watched the numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were sinking ships at a rate that would have won the First World War. But this was not the First World War. This was a conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity defied comprehension. The math was merciless. Dönitz calculated that his U-boat needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month to strangle Britain. In 1942, they came close, but by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The target kept moving, always receding, always beyond reach. Worse, the Americans were learning. The early disasters off the East Coast had exposed failures in anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were organized. Aircraft were deployed to patrol the shipping lanes. New technologies like radar and improved sonar gave the defenders advantages they had lacked. In May 1943, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his U-boat from the Atlantic. In a single month, 43 submarines had been lost. The tonnage they sank no longer justified the casualties they suffered. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany needed to win to strangle Britain, was lost. The U-boat crews, who survived the May disaster, returned to occupied France in shock. They had gone to sea believing they were winning. They came back to port, understanding they had lost. The endless convoys they had hunted now sailed with escorts they could not penetrate. The Allied aircraft that had once been rare now seemed to be everywhere. The technological superiority that German submarines had enjoyed was gone. What happened at sea was replicated in the air. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit became the symbol of American industrial might. Designed by famed industrial architect Albert Kuhn, the facility covered 312 million square feet, making it the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. Its purpose was to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber, more complex than anything Ford had ever manufactured. The challenges were immense. The B-24 had over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It required precision engineering that the automobile industry had never attempted. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied the aircraft manufacturer consolidated methods and found them primitive. Bombers were being assembled outdoors by hand using techniques that had not changed in decades. Sorensen proposed something revolutionary. He would build bombers on a moving assembly line, just like automobiles. Critics called the idea insane. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed that you could not expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. The skepticism was not unreasonable. Aircraft manufacturing was fundamentally different from automobile production. A car could have minor variations and still function perfectly. An aircraft with minor variations might fall out of the sky. The tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. The materials were exotic alloys that behaved differently than automotive steel. The systems, hydraulics, electrical, pneumatic, had to work in perfect harmony at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Ford struggled initially. The government kept changing the aircraft's design, which disrupted the assembly line. Workers had to learn entirely new skills. The press mocked the facility as will it run instead of Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman investigated the delays and publicly questioned whether Ford could deliver on its promises. The problems were real. Consolidated Aircraft, which had designed the B-24, kept making modifications based on combat experience. Every change required Ford to retool its assembly line. Dies that had cost thousands of dollars became obsolete overnight. Workers who had mastered one process had to be retrained for another. Ford's response was characteristically stubborn. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting Consolidated's hand-drawn sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. They produced 5 miles of technical drawings per day. When Consolidated modifications made drawings obsolete before they could be implemented, Ford engineers started over without complaint. The company also decentralized production. Instead of building entire aircraft at Willow Run, Ford created a network of subcontractors who manufactured components that were then shipped to the main plant for final assembly. Engines came from Buick in Flint. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. Landing gear came from Goodyear in Ohio. The logistics alone would have been impossible for any organization that had not spent decades mastering supply chain management. By 1944, the problems were solved. Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. At peak production in April 1944, the plant turned out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24 and April 26 of that year, 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in just 72 hours. The workers operated in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The remaining 6 hours each day were used to restock parts, perform maintenance, and change tooling. Even with this relentless schedule, the workforce was reduced from 42,000 to 17,000 as efficiency improved. The same number of bombers required fewer and fewer workers to produce. The Army Air Forces eventually had to tell Ford to slow down. They had no place to park all the aircraft. Storage areas at training bases overflowed with B-24s waiting for crews. The production capacity exceeded the military's ability to deploy the aircraft. Meanwhile, American aircraft production overall reached numbers that the German High Command had declared impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft. That single year's production exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, accounting for roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The scale defied comprehension. At its peak, American industry was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany had possessed at the start of the war. The assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts changed at midnight and noon again. The factories never stopped. Consider what these numbers meant in practical terms. 300,000 aircraft would stretch wingtip to wingtip for more than 30,000 miles, enough to circle the Earth at the equator. The fuel to fly. These aircraft required an entire petroleum infrastructure, tankers, and pipelines and refineries dedicated to aviation gasoline. The crews to man them required a training establishment that processed hundreds of thousands of young men through programs that turned civilians into combat aviators in less than a year. The scale of American Mobilization went beyond what simple statistics could capture. Behind every aircraft, every ship, every tank was a supply chain that stretched back to mines and forests and farms across the continent. Aluminum came from bauxite, ore shipped from South America. Rubber came from plantations in Liberia and Brazil after Japanese conquests cut off Asian supplies. Cotton-free uniforms came from southern farms. Food came from the agricultural heartland. The entire economy was reoriented toward war production. Women who had never worked outside the home learned to operate machinery their mothers had never seen. African Americans migrated north to take factory jobs previously closed to them. Rural Americans moved to industrial cities where housing shortages forced families to live in shifts with day workers sleeping in beds vacated by night workers. The social transformation was as dramatic as the industrial one. The Germans faced the consequences of their misjudgment in the skies over Europe. Their pilots were among the best trained in the world. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and the Fowler-Wolf 190, were formidable machines. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed their American counterparts. The early American bomber crews were painfully green. Many pilots had fewer than 300 hours of total flight time when they began flying combat missions. Navigation errors sent formations miles off course. Bombing accuracy was poor. Coordination with fighter escorts was imperfect. German pilots exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe developed tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and pick off stragglers. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour gave gunners only seconds to react. German fighters equipped with rockets could fire from beyond the range of defensive machine guns. But attrition was relentless. For every German aircraft shot down, the Americans could produce 3 more. For every experienced German pilot killed, the Americans could train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an enemy who could absorb losses and keep coming. The American training programs were industrial in their own right. Flight schools processed thousands of cadets simultaneously. Instructors flew multiple training sorties per day. Aircraft were available in abundance because the same factories that built combat planes also built trainers. The entire system was designed for throughput, for turning raw material into finished product as efficiently as possible. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was sustaining losses of 25% of its aircrew and 40% of its aircraft every month. These were losses no air force could survive indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich did not have 1,000 years of pilots to sacrifice. German pilots who had begun the war with years of training and hundreds of flight hours were replaced by men who had weeks of instruction and dozens of hours in the cockpit. The average experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots dropped steadily throughout 1944. By the war's end, some German pilots were flying their first combat mission with less than 100 hours of total flight time. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to improve. Early bomber crews had been painfully inexperienced, but the survivors of the 1943 raids became the instructors who trained the 1944 crews. Tactics evolved. Equipment improved. The P-51 Mustang with its long range and exceptional performance finally gave bomber formations the protection they needed. The German misjudgment extended beyond industry to the fighting quality of American soldiers themselves. In February 1943, American ground forces met the German army in combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result appeared to confirm every German prejudice. Field Marshal Owen RML's Afrika Korps tore through the inexperienced American positions. Units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control collapsed. American casualties exceeded 6,000. Some German officers who had dismissed Americans as soft now had battlefield evidence to support their contempt. The Americans at Kasserine were green in ways that only combat could reveal. Many soldiers had never fired there. Weapons in anger. Officers who had trained for years in peacetime conditions found themselves unable to function. Under fire. Radio communications failed. Coordination between infantry and armor broke down. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was among those captured during the debacle. He had led an armored counterattack against German positions at Sidi Bizid. The attack ran straight into German panzers and anti-tank guns positioned in a classic ambush. American tanks burst into flame. Infantry scattered. Waters was wounded, captured, and spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Stories like his multiplied across the battlefield. American artillery was poorly positioned. American infantry dug foxholes in the wrong places. American armor advanced without reconnaissance. The Germans, who had been fighting in the desert for 2 years, exploited every mistake with professional precision. RML himself initially scorned the green American troops. They seemed undisciplined and poorly led compared to the British forces he had been fighting for 2 years. The debacle at Kasserine reinforced the German belief that American material superiority could be offset by German fighting quality. Reports from the battle filtered back to Berlin. German intelligence officers compiled assessments that confirmed what Hitler had always believed. The Americans were soft. Their equipment was abundant, but their soldiers were weak. German martial spirit would triumph over American industrial power. But RML was too good a general to let initial impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He watched what happened after Kasserine, and what he saw troubled him. The Americans recovered with startling speed. Within weeks of the disaster, they reorganized their forces, relieved incompetent commanders, and implemented brutal lessons learned. General George Patton took command of the demoralized Second Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. Tactics improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery tightened. Air support became more effective. Patton was a force of nature. He descended on the Second Corps like a thunderstorm, demanding discipline, punishing sloppiness, and driving his men to standards they had never met before. Soldiers who had slouched through the Kasserine disaster found themselves polishing brass, standing at attention and training harder than they had ever trained in their lives. But Patton did more than imposed discipline. He studied why the Americans had failed and implemented specific corrections. Artillery forward observers were repositioned. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to coordinate more closely with armor. The lessons of Kasserine were analyzed, documented, and disseminated. The American military possessed an institutional commitment to learning from failure that the Germans failed to recognize. After Kasserine, the Army's ground forces commander, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, conducted a comprehensive review of what had gone wrong. His findings were sent back to training camps across the United States, where they shaped the preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. The mistakes of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. RML later recorded his observations. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class, he wrote. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance. Unlike many German generals, RML did not make the mistake of underestimating how fast the Americans learned from their failures. Carlo d'Este, a historian who studied RML's papers, noted that the Desert Fox observed something important about American forces after Kasserine. Things had rapidly improved for them. RML wrote, although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare. Even after the initial disaster, RML recognized that he was watching an opponent who would only get better. By May 1943, 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner of war cages, more than had surrendered at Stalingrad. The Americans, who had panicked at Kasserine, were now among the victors. The speed of the American recovery shocked German commanders who had expected a longer period of demoralization. In their experience, units that had been routed required months to rebuild their effectiveness. The Americans had rebuilt in weeks. The psychological resilience this demonstrated was perhaps more troubling than the material resources. German prisoners captured in Tunisia reported their surprise at American logistics. The American soldiers they fought seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited food. When German units ran short of supplies, they had to improvise. When American units ran short, replacement supplies arrived within days. The lesson was clear to German intelligence officers who analyzed the North African campaign. Material superiority could compensate for inexperience. The Americans had been outfought at Kasserine, but they had never been outproduced. As long as American factories kept running, American armies would keep fighting. The question was whether Germany could win quickly enough to make the production differential irrelevant. After Tunisia, that question had an answer. They could not. The pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces stumbled initially, learned rapidly, and improved continuously. The same troops who had fled from German tanks in Tunisia would storm the beaches of Normandy and fight their way across France. The same pilots who had been outmaneuvered by experienced Luftwaffe veterans would eventually sweep the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was built into American institutions. The Army's Ground Forces Command maintained a continuous feedback loop between combat units and training establishments. After action, reports from the front were analyzed within weeks and incorporated into revised training programs. Doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. The system was not elegant. It was often chaotic. Different units developed different solutions to similar problems. Coordination between branches of service was imperfect, but the chaos was productive. Ideas that worked survived and spread. Ideas that failed were abandoned. The organization as a whole became more effective even when individual components struggled. German military culture, by contrast, had calcified around fixed doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged. Failure was often fatal to careers. The same rigidity that had produced the brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances changed. The Wehrmacht could execute plans with devastating efficiency, but it struggled to adapt when those plans went wrong. Hitler made this rigidity worse. He interfered constantly in military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer was career-ending at best and potentially fatal. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The contrast between American and German organizational cultures was starkest in the treatment of failure. When American commanders failed, they were replaced, but they were rarely punished. General Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the debacle at Kasserine Pass, was relieved of command but sent back to the United States to train new troops. His experience, even failed experience, was considered valuable. When German commanders failed, they risked not just their careers, but their lives. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty were executed. Even success was no guarantee of safety if it came at the cost of contradicting Hitler's orders. This created a culture of conformity at the worst possible time. German officers who recognized the impossibility of their strategic situation often said nothing because speaking honestly was too dangerous. The information that reached Hitler was filtered through layers of people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The German generals who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine never fully adjusted their assessments. They attributed American success to material abundance alone, refusing to acknowledge the organizational learning that made that abundance effective. They continued to believe that German martial spirit could overcome American industry even as American armies pushed them back across France, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. When D-Day came in June 1944, German commanders in France were surprised by the scale of the invasion force. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics required to move this force across the English Channel and supply it on hostile shores represented an organizational achievement that German planners had considered impossible. The American role in the invasion was overwhelming. The equipment that supported the assault, the landing craft, the transport aircraft, the tanks and trucks that moved inland from the beaches came largely from American factories. The ships that bombarded German positions were built in American yards. The aircraft that dominated the skies were produced on American assembly lines. German defenders fought with characteristic tenacity. In some sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material the Allies brought to bear. When an American infantry company encountered a defended position, they called for artillery support. The artillery fire that followed was not a few rounds, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells falling in concentrated barges that pulverized defensive positions. When the infantry advanced, tanks supported them. When the tanks were stopped, aircraft were called in. The Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that multiplied their combat power. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front said the American style of warfare was different from Soviet tactics. The Soviets threw men at problems. The Americans threw machines. The outcome was similar. Overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the human cost to the Americans was lower. This was deliberate. American doctrine explicitly prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk soldiers when you could expend ammunition instead? Hitler's misjudgment had consequences that rippled through every level of German strategy. Because he believed America would not intervene effectively, he declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, bringing into the conflict an enemy he did not need to fight. Because he believed American industry could not deliver on its promises, he allowed the U-boat campaign to continue long after it had ceased to be strategically viable. Because he believed American soldiers were soft, he failed to reinforce the Western Front adequately until it was too late. The declaration of war on America in December 1941 remains one of the most inexplicable strategic decisions of the 20th century. Germany was not obligated to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement required mutual defense only if one partner was attacked, not if one partner attacked others. Hitler could have remained neutral toward America while Japan fought in the Pacific. His advisors pointed this out. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop reminded Hitler that a declaration of war would add another enemy without corresponding benefit. But Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More importantly, he did not believe America mattered. A nation of racial mongrels divided by class and corrupted by Jewish influence could not possibly affect the outcome of the war. This contempt shaped German strategy throughout the conflict. Resources that might have strengthened the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere because the American industrial threat was not taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have bolstered North African defenses were sent to the Eastern Front because the Mediterranean was considered a secondary theater. Preparations for an Allied invasion were inadequate because the scale of American power was not understood. The men who had dismissed American production figures as propaganda watched those figures become reality. The generals who had scorned American fighting quality found themselves retreating before American armies. The strategists who had calculated that Germany could win a war of attrition discovered that attrition favored the side with more to sacrifice. By 1944, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts with resources barely adequate. 4-1. The Eastern Front consumed most of Germany's military strength. The Mediterranean theater drained divisions that might have defended France. And the bombing campaign conducted largely by American aircraft devastated German industry and cities. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, deployed formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers on daylight missions over Germany that would have been unthinkable without American industrial power. Early operations endured catastrophic losses. German fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses exacted a heavy toll, yet the Americans absorbed the casualties and pressed on. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and their crews during a single raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. The proportional losses were worse than anything the Luftwaffe had experienced. American commanders debated whether daylight bombing could continue, but U.S. factories replaced the lost aircraft within weeks. Replacement crews arrived from expanded training programs designed to meet the surging demand. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was stronger than it had been prior to Schweinfurt and now possessed long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, capable of protecting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe faced an impossible equation. Every American plane shot down was replaced by 3 more, while every veteran German pilot killed was irreplaceable. The attrition balance, which German strategists had assumed would favor their superior training and tactics, had inverted. Hermann Göring, who had dismissed American production claims as fantasy, witnessed his Air Force being annihilated by the very industrial might he had ridiculed. In a post-war prison interview, he admitted that the pace of American shipbuilding, particularly Henry Kaiser's program, had astonished and unsettled German planners. Claims of building ships in 8 to 10 days had seemed implausible. They were not implausible, they were factual. By spring 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies encroached from the east. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing that the Luftwaffe could no longer contest. The factories that had manufactured the Wehrmacht's weapons lay in ruins. The final months exposed how thoroughly German planning had failed. Strategic reserves were depleted, fuel stocks exhausted, and the transportation network fractured. Industries that had survived years of air raids finally succumbed to systematic destruction. German soldiers fought with characteristic tenacity, but without hope. Ammunition was rationed, vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. Replacement equipment ceased to arrive because the factories that produced it no longer functioned. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered much of Europe, was reduced to scavenging for supplies. American forces, by contrast, appeared limitless in resources. Destroyed tanks were replaced, expended ammunition was replenished. The logistical network supporting the Allied advance was itself a marvel of industrial coordination, moving millions of tons of supplies across oceans and continents to front lines. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that supplied Allied troops after the Normandy breakout, transported 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. American drivers, many African Americans serving in segregated transport units, drove continuously to sustain advancing armies with fuel, ammunition, and food. The convoys consumed more fuel than the combat forces they supported, but America had fuel to spare. Germany did not. This abundance extended to every dimension of American military operations. Soldiers received hot meals while Germans foraged. Units had medical support that evacuated the wounded within hours. German casualties often died awaiting treatment. American armies had spare parts for damaged vehicles. German forces cannibalized broken machines to keep others operational. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30, 1945, still convinced that if Germany failed, it was because the people had failed him, his generals had betrayed him, or fate had conspired against him. He never admitted that his core assumptions about America had been mistaken. Until his final days, Hitler raved about miracle weapons, phantom divisions, and impossible counteroffensives. The nation he had deemed racially inferior and industrially impotent had annihilated his armies. The evidence was undeniable. America, which he had dismissed as decayed, had outproduced Germany by nearly 3-1. The people he had labeled soft had fought with determination and ferocity across 2 oceans. The industrial might he had ridiculed had buried the Wehrmacht beneath a deluge of steel and explosives. The statistics spoke for themselves. American industry produced nearly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, including 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million army trucks. These numbers were not exaggeration, they were fact. Henry Kaiser did not become a household name after the war. He returned to private enterprise, building hospitals, automobiles, and housing. The shipyards that had launched vessels every few days were dismantled or converted for peacetime production. Workers who had achieved what experts deemed impossible returned to ordinary jobs. Willow Run, which had produced more bombers than Germany could shoot down, was sold to civilian manufacturers. The assembly lines that churned out B-24 Liberators every 63 minutes were reconfigured for consumer production. By the time General Motors closed the plant in 2010, few remembered its wartime significance. The men and women who built the arsenal of democracy scattered to ordinary lives. Welders returned to farms and factories, riveters became homemakers and teachers. Yet some retained memories. Charles Sorensen, the Ford executive behind the Willow Run line, documented their achievements. Kaiser's shipyard workers formed reunion associations for decades. Women who worked in factories were eventually honored at the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park at Richmond Shipyards, established in 2000. Their accomplishments carry enduring lessons. German misjudgment of America was not merely intelligence failure, it was a failure of imagination. German leaders saw what they expected, a soft, divided, undisciplined nation incapable of war. They did not see reality, a sleeping giant with industrial prowess, organizational talent, and human determination that proved unstoppable once mobilized. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned Pearl Harbor, understood what Germany did not. Having studied in America, he warned post-attack that they had awakened a sleeping giant filled with terrible resolve. Germany lacked a comparable voice of caution because it never took America seriously enough to study it. Liberty Ship and V-24 factories have largely vanished, the workers who staffed them passed into history. The war they helped win ended 8 decades ago, but their story endures. Misjudgment still costs lives, nations underestimate adversaries and leaders confuse assumptions with reality. The German High Command believed what they wanted about America, leading to catastrophic miscalculations. Nazi ideology taught that racial purity determined national strength. America, with immigrants and African Americans, seemed to disprove this. Therefore, German leaders assumed weakness. This was the core error. German strategists began with conclusions and sought evidence to support them. They observed American unpreparedness in 1939 and concluded Americans could not mobilize. They saw diversity and assumed disunity. They saw comfort and concluded Americans could not sacrifice. Each assessment was wrong. Americans mobilized faster than expected, unified remarkably, and sacrificed in unimaginable ways. German leadership could not perceive this because it challenged their central worldview. History may not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. Generals and admirals who dismissed American production, ridiculed fighting quality, and underestimated material abundance were competent men who allowed preconceptions to override evidence. They perceived the America they expected, ignoring the reality. The industrial might that crushed Nazi Germany emerged from Richmond shipyard workers, Willow Run assembly lines, and ordinary people turned soldiers, logisticians, and welders. These were ordinary individuals achieving extraordinary feats under extraordinary circumstances. Housewives welded, farmers fought overseas, bureaucrats transported millions of tons of supplies. They learned new skills, endured hardships, and accomplished the impossible, then returned to ordinary lives largely unspeaking of their achievements. German misjudgment ultimately reflected a failure to grasp human potential. Hitler saw only limitations, not Americans' capacity to grow, adapt, and rise to daunting challenges. He mistook the America of peace for the America under pressure. This is the paramount lesson: nations are not static. Societies are not fixed. What appears weak in one era can become powerful in the next if its people possess will and organizational capability. Germany had built a military over decades. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in 1939 was the product of long-term planning, training, and investment. German strategists assumed this head start was decisive and unassailable. They were wrong. America closed the gap in months, not by matching German quality, which required years, but by overwhelming quantity with American abundance. The American method was less elegant, less polished, but ultimately more effective. Hitler viewed a decayed America that could not hold together. He failed to see the true America, the one that built ships in days, bombers in hours, transformed raw recruits into soldiers in months, absorbed defeats, learned, and returned stronger. That America, chaotic by German standards, triumphed.